There's another report that came out that kind of contradicts the US increasing support for Ukraine. So Pentagon officials told European leaders in August that the US plans to cut back military aid to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They warned Europe needs to rely less on America, since Trump wants the US military focus more on homeland defense. So we've got that report, but we've also got the report of Trump telling, I think it was Lithuania's leader, to shoot down, or Estonia's leader, to shoot down any Russian jets, giving them authority to shoot them down. But later on, when asked whether the US would get involved if that happens, he said, depends on a case-by-case basis. Rubio walked down those comments. What do you make of all this?
The last time that I spoke privately and personally with President Trump, when I was in the administration in November, December of 2020, and before that in April of 2020, when I first met him, he made it very clear to me that he wanted to dramatically reduce European dependence upon the United States. There's no question about it militarily. And we exchanged views. And the idea was, he said, frankly, Doug, what do you think happens? Are the Germans ever going to increase their investment in defense? And I said, yes, sir, when we leave. And he knows that. Nothing fundamentally is going to change in Europe until we get out of it. And that's not just in military terms, that's in political terms as well. Our presence, our influence in Europe right now is a crutch that enables the Europeans to avoid doing the things that they need to do. And one of the things they absolutely need to do is get along with Russia. Stop pretending the Russians are going to invade. They're not interested in invading. It's over.
It could. We've seen China fill that void as the US is pulling out, especially with the alienation of the Gulf countries. China's increasingly filling that void in the Gulf nations. Could we see China fill that void that the US is leaving in Europe and the alienation of European allies? I know it's a stretch.
You mean militarily?
Militarily, yeah.
No. I think what the Chinese are doing, which is extremely important right now, is that they have concluded accurately that the dollar is failing. If the dollar is failing, what do you do with all the treasury bonds that you purchase from the United States? You begin to dump them. They've been reducing their vulnerability to the dollar's weakness for months, from over 1 billion down to about 750 million. And I think it's continuing to drop. What they're doing instead is that they're opening gold vaults, one in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, one that will be in Hong Kong. These are beyond the Shanghai Gold Exchange. These vaults are going to contain great quantities of gold for gold-backed transactions. Now, what are these gold-backed transactions designed to replace? They're going to replace the petrodollar. This is so when China ships whatever goods it does, military or otherwise, to Saudi Arabia can pay in gold. If the Chinese buy oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, the Chinese can pay for it in gold. These are literally warehouses with gold in them. And you move the gold from point A to point B as it changes hands. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can still trade in yuan. And right now, Saudi Arabia and China are trading in yuan because the yuan is de facto backed by gold. So the lesson is fiat currency can be diluted. Fiat currency, the United States dollar, is being debased by our country. We are debasing it because we don't want to restructure the debt. In other words, we don't want to go through default. So we're debasing the currency. This isn't going to work because the rest of the world now treats the dollar as poison. The problem for the Chinese and BRICS in general is that their banking system is not as fully developed and sophisticated as ours. But they are conducting transactions across international lines in their respective currencies. That's going to grow more and more in the near future. Fewer and fewer people are going to use the dollar. That handwriting's on the wall.
Yeah, I think you've put that as well on your post that for the first time ever. And just before I continue, quick correction. I think what you meant earlier is from $1 trillion to 750 billion in terms of U.S. treasuries by China, not a billion. But you did talk about how for the first time ever, as a reserve asset, gold has overtaken the US dollar. I think this is a silent threat to the US that no one's talking about as the US continues to overextend itself. But what looks worse, kind of as we slowly wrap up, what looks worse than what's happening in Europe for the US is what's happening in the Middle East. We've seen that defense pact between Saudi and Pakistan. Saudi's hedging their bets. We've seen China in talks with those Gulf nations to supply even more weaponry. How far do you think Israel will go with American support? And do you think they will continue alienating those Gulf nations, or do you think the US will be able to perform some damage control after the strikes on Qatar?
Yeah, I think the damage control is going to be tough. I think this Abraham Accords is dead on arrival. So I think we're in a new era. So I think what the Chinese are doing is enabling the coalescence of Muslim nations into an alliance that can respond to Israel. I think you're going to see Chinese strike weapons, missiles, radars, and so forth, the most recent technologically advanced available, show up in places like Egypt. Not just in Egypt, probably in the Emirates. I fully expect something similar will happen with the Turks. All of these nations have had it with us. You know, the problem we face, and we don't understand this, I know that President Trump doesn't. What's happening between Israel and the rest of the Muslim world is as follows. There will be no two-state solution anymore. That may have been possible at one point, but it will not exist in the future. So you get one of two outcomes. Either there is no Palestinian state, there is only an Israeli state, or you get a Palestinian state and there will be no more Israeli state. In other words, this is a fight to the finish. This is a battle of annihilation now, and the region is arming itself for that outcome. China is enabling that in its own way. Now, the Russians are also interested in this because they are heavily invested in Iran and its role in BRICS and its role in commerce and military cooperation and everything else with Russia. So Russia is also involved, but China has taken the lead on this thing from an economic and a military assistance standpoint. We are probably not noticing, or we're not accepting this reality, because if we did, we'd turn to the Israelis and say, it's time to stop. But since the Israelis control us and we don't control them, and Mr. Netanyahu controls Trump, Trump doesn't control Mr. Netanyahu, that's very unlikely to happen. So what I see instead is a resumption of the war between Netanyahu, Israel, and Iran. And that will probably spread across the region. This time around, it will not simply be Iran.
That's a pretty bleak way to end it, Colonel.
Well, you asked the question, Mario. What am I supposed to do?
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you again, sir. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Right.
Have a good day, sir. Bye-bye.